So what I'm going to talk about in the first part of today's session is interviews, and then in the second part I'm going to talk about surveys and audience research. Now let me just precede this by saying that basically interviews is what we call a research methodology. So far in this module with me you've done quantitative analysis, which is a research method. With Chris you've done another research method which is called discourse analysis, which is a type of qualitative research method. So interviews, they are also qualitative rather than quantitative. So this is essentially your third research method that you're going to learn about, plus a few more that Chris has spoken about as well. So slide number 6. If you remember way back when, week 2, gosh, it seems like ancient history, doesn't it? There were still leaves on the trees when we started. So if you think about session number 2, I spoke about the sociology of news, and we had this process that starts on the left hand side with a light bulb which represents an idea or a source of news. The next stage is the affronted man leaning back, how dare you, being interviewed. So then what the journalist does is, once he or she has his or her idea, they go out and interview people and gather information. The next stage, fingers on keyboards, that's producing the news, producing the journalism. The next stage shows the presentation, the product, and the final stage on the right hand side is the audience. So the sociology of news looks at that whole process, and you can divide it and break it down into different components. Now the key point here, folks, and I stress this because it happens every year, there's always one student, sometimes two, who says, right, I want to use that research method. They've got it in their mind that they want to do interviews or they want to do surveys, and then they talk to me about it, and I look at their topic and it's totally not suited to interviews or surveys. So it's really important, and it's obvious, that you use the appropriate method for what you want to discover. That's really, really, really important. So if you want to find out, for example, how the Daily Mail reported Black Lives Matter in the summer, interviews won't give you the same quality of information as content analysis would. So you need to do a quantitative and qualitative content analysis to understand how a newspaper reports something. Okay, so it all depends on what you want to discover. It all depends on what you want to find out. So next slide, number 7. So let me just give you a reminder here. So stage 2 and stage 4. So stage 2 is the information gathering stage of journalism, and this is where journalists speak to their sources. They go and speak to people, politicians, business people, members of the public, whoever. And what you can do, as I demonstrated last week, is that you can analyze the sources. So you can look at the product. Think about it as reading articles like I did last week and highlighting every time somebody speaks. So that's quantitative content analysis. You're looking at the content, which is the news itself, which is the journalism itself, and you're counting how many politicians, how many MPs, how many business people, how many scientists. So that's quantitative content analysis. And then stage 4, the product itself. So we're looking here, for example, at the representation of people. Jeremy Corbyn, who was somebody we looked at a couple of weeks ago with those 2 academic articles. We're looking at protesters, for example. Do you remember the turtles and the anarchists? And we're also looking at political ideas, how certain idea, Black Lives Matter is a political idea, how that is represented in the news. So again, that's quantitative content analysis. You're looking at the news and you're counting how many times somebody is mentioned, how many times a pejorative word is used to describe Jeremy Corbyn, for example. That's quantitative. And then what Chris did, he did it from a slightly different angle. He looked at the qualitative content analysis, which is the discourse. So that's looking at the language used to describe Jeremy Corbyn or Black Lives Matter or whoever it might be. Okay, so in those 2 instances, if you're doing source analysis, or if you're doing how people are represented and how people and groups and ideas are represented, that's content analysis. You can do both. You can do quantitative and qualitative. Okay, so the question here is, could interviews help you? Well, they could, I guess, help you in terms of sources and product, because you could ask journalists why they do what they do, which is kind of what I did for the final part of my PhD. But my point here, folks, is don't be led by your method. You know, don't say I'm going to do interviews even though it's not really the appropriate method. So make sure you use the appropriate method for the appropriate research. So what are, slide number 8, so what are interviews useful for? So interviews are really good at understanding journalists, and we'll come on to understanding audiences in a moment. So interviews are really good for understanding how people make decisions and what goes through their mind and how they think about things and how they make sense of the world. So I've given some examples here for the first 3 stages of that journalism process. So where news comes from, how journalists gather their information, and how they make the news, stage number 3. So questions like, who are you? You know, what's your background? What's your training? You know, how do you identify? Those sorts of things. Second question, how do you do what you do? And third question, why do you do what you do? So those 3 questions essentially are the sorts of questions that you'll ask journalists about their work. And you can't get that from content analysis. You cannot figure out how journalists do what they do just by reading articles. You can guess, but it's really, really dangerous territory. You know, you can say, for example, that somebody's written a sentence and you say, oh, the journalist wrote that because she hates Jeremy Corbyn, or because she's anti-Semitic, or whatever it might be. You cannot deduce from somebody's writing what their intentions are. But interviewing journalists can really enlighten you as to how journalists do their job and why they do it in the way that they do. Okay, so if any of you are doing a research project which involves understanding professional practice, essentially, interviews are the way forward. Interviews are the way forward. And the other word I've used there, which you may or may not have heard before, is ethnography. So an ethnography is basically a study of groups, essentially. Now, way back when, in the old days, it used to be used for sort of people studying sort of, you know, tribes in the middle of Borneo or wherever it might be, understanding different cultures, essentially. And what would happen is an academic would go and live with a tribe in the jungle for 6 months and just sit there and make notes and interact and see how people live their lives, and then write a book about it. And personally, I find that sort of stuff fascinating. And in the 20th century, that technique was then modified slightly and used in professional situations. So there are some actually quite famous journalism ethnographies where literally the researcher has gone into the newsroom, into the the factory, the news factory, and sat with journalists and made notes and observed and so on, and just observing people in their natural habitat, essentially. And journalists journalists are essentially a tribe. You know, they're a group of people with a shared purpose, a shared culture, shared values, and that's why that technique was used. So I recommend that you don't do ethnography, because it's long, drawn out, complicated, and a heck of a lot of work. But just be aware that it exists. So if you really want to understand how professional people do their work, you've got to hang out with them for a long time and make a lot of notes and do interviews as well. So if you want to understand journalists, interviews and ethnography, and next slide number 9. And if you want to understand audiences, the people that consume the journalism, or the media, doesn't have to be journalism, it could be film, it could be music, it could be anything. So stage 5, the final point in the sociology of journalism, the consumption of journalism. If you want to understand journalism, understand audiences, then there are essentially 3 related approaches that you can use. Interviews, in much the same way that you would interview journalists. So you would ask them, why do you believe what you believe, or what do you believe in the first place? What do you consume? Why do you consume it? When I say what do you consume, what programs do you watch? You know, why do you watch them? Who are you? You know, tell us about your life, tell us about your income and your relationships, and you know how you identify and all that. And the other question, of course, is what do you think about the content? What do you think about the TV programs that you watch? You know, what's good about them, what's not so good about them? So here you've got 3 related methodologies, if you like, for understanding audiences. You've got interviews, so in much the same way that you'd interview a journalist, you can interview audience members. You can look at surveys, so these are not just individuals but looking at groups of people. you know, asking hundreds of people about their viewing habits, or thousands of people even, and focus groups. And we'll come on to focus groups, but essentially, as the name suggests, it's a small group of people and they are all asked the same questions and they kind of discuss it around a table. So the point of these first few slides, folks, is to emphasize to you that the method should match what you want to achieve. What you want to achieve. So please, and it happens every year, even though I do this class, there's always somebody who says, I'm going to do interviews. Then I say, well, it doesn't really suit you, what you're trying to find out. And then they get upset, usually with me. But it's not my fault, you know. You've got to think that the method is determined by what you want to achieve. The method is determined by what you want to achieve. So next slide, slide number 10, this emphasizes this. So on the left hand side, it says content practitioners audience. So if you're a bit confused about this, your first question is, what are you looking at? So on the left hand side, are you looking at content? So if the answer is yes, you are looking at content. And I've seen quite a lot of your ideas so far, and most of you, if not, I'd say all of you, you are looking at content. So interviews, not relevant. Surveys, not relevant. Focus groups, not relevant. Ethnography, not relevant. Okay. However, if you're looking at practitioners, the people that make the news, the journalists, the editors and so on, interviews, yes, they are relevant. Surveys, maybe. There are surveys about journalists. They do exist, so they are quite useful. Focus groups, not really. I've never really seen that, journalist interviewed in focus groups. It's actually quite a scary prospect to have a room full of journalists all arguing and disagreeing with each other. Ethnography, maybe. And like I said, there have been some classic journalism ethnographies over the years. But they're a lot of work. That's why I'm saying maybe. That's PhD territory. That's three-year project territory, ethnographies. It's not a 3-month project territory. So you see there, practitioners, you've got some choices here. An audience, if you're doing an audience study, why people watch what they do, what people think of certain audiences, then interviews are relevant, surveys are relevant, focus groups, maybe. I said maybe because, as we'll find out later, they're a lot of work. And ethnography, you can't really, well, you can hang around with an audience, but can you imagine cohabiting with a family for 3 months and just sitting there on the sofa and just watching them watch TV? I mean, that's essentially what an ethnography would be. So there are different options available here, but just be aware, excuse me, if you're doing content, then interviews, surveys, focus groups and ethnographies are not relevant. And that's what this slide's all about. It's all about what you want to find out, and you use the appropriate method for the appropriate research project. Okay, but after saying all that, slide number 11, after saying all that, what I am going to do is spend quite a few minutes now just telling you about interviews. Now, the reason I'm going to do this, even though the majority of you are not using interviews for your assessments in CCTA, you might be using them next year, next calendar year, in your dissertation and with other modules as well. So I'm going to give you a few hints and tips and a bit of guidance on how to do interviews. Now, I'm going to start this, slide number 11, let me have a glass of water. I'm going to start this by warning everybody that interviews are deceptively hard work. And as you will see in a few moments, there is a lot of preparation that needs to go into it. The easy bit is actually the interview itself, when you're sitting there and listening to somebody. But before that and after that, you, the researcher, have a huge amount of work to do, and it seems almost endless. So please go into interviews with your eyes fully open. So, slide number 12. And as always, when you've got a lot of work to do, the best tip I can give you, and I've learned this through many years of painful experience, if you've got a lot of work to do, the most sensible thing to do is to break it down into pieces. Think about it in terms of stages. And it's almost like a novel, you know, in terms of interviews, it's almost like a novel. You know, like most novels and films for that matter, they've got 3 stages. People call it the 3-act play. So Shakespeare, a lot of 3-act play. So the classic example is boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. That's a 3-act play. And it's the same with interviews. You've got the pre-interview, you've got during the interview, and you've got post-interview. So think about your interviews as a three-stage process. Like I said, some students go into it and they just think about the middle one. They just think, well, you just turn up and you ask a few questions. But there's so much more to it than that if you want to get the most out of interviews. So slide number 13, I'm reiterating this and I'm reiterating this. Really, really important. Before you do anything, you need to check and double check with your supervisor that interviews are actually relevant to your topic. So don't think that you have to do interviews in the blue box there. If you're looking at content only, don't do interviews. Don't do interviews at all. Don't even think about them. Just focus on content analysis. But there could be examples where you, in a research project, where you do content analysis and some interviews on top. Interviews are really good at explaining content. You know, why is it that you always speak to footballers but you don't speak to football fans? You know, trying to find out, that's something that you might identify in a content analysis, that sports journalists speak to footballers but not fans. But as to why that happens, the only people who can tell you are the journalists. So you could do content analysis and interviews, but I think most of you, if not all of you that I've seen so far, you're doing content-based research, which is perfectly fine. So point number one, are interviews relevant to your topic? Point number two, the second point, slide 14, this is also pre-interview. So when you're thinking about who to interview, I would say focus on experts. And when I say experts, I put it in speech marks. I don't mean academics, not necessarily. They might be the experts. So if you're going to do COVID, something about COVID, and you want to understand the science, then obviously you will go to the professors. Okay, so they're experts in that territory. But experts also extend, for example, if you want to find out what is it like to be a single mum, you know, speak to single mums. You know, don't speak to people like me because I'm not a single mum, you know, or don't speak to academics. If you actually want to know what somebody's day-to-day life experience is like, then that person is an expert. So the contractors outside my house who've now gone, thankfully, you know, they're experts in digging up roads and replacing gas mains. So those are the people you want to speak to if that's what your subject is about. So think about who are the best people to enlighten you. And again, I say this because it doesn't happen every year, thankfully, but it has happened quite a lot in the past, is that a student wants to find something out, and to find that out, they go and speak to their partner. You know, and I said, well, in fact, there was an example a few years ago, and it was a good, quite a painful example, and the student had spoken to her sister about something, and it was about the production of her topic was about journalism. And she spoke to her sister. Now, her sister happened to be a doctor, a medical doctor. And so the student said, well, she's a doctor. She knows what she's talking about. She's intelligent, you know, but she's not a journalist. And we actually had quite a heated discussion about that, because I felt that I was actually insulting her sister by saying that she's not the relevant person. She was a doctor, not a journalist. So if you want to understand about journalism, you go and speak to journalists. They will tell you how it's made. Doctors won't tell you. You know, contractors won't tell you how. They'll give you an opinion, but they won't tell you a definitive answer. So think who are the best people to enlighten you. Aim high but be realistic. I say this for a couple of reasons, but one of them is in my experience, you might be surprised at who will give you the time for an interview. And when I did my PhD, I aimed high. I aimed at senior BBC journalists, and quite a few of them, in fact, I would say pretty much all of them replied, and about half of the seniors, they actually agreed. And I was pleasantly surprised by that they actually agreed. And that was all a case of aiming high. So I aimed at senior BBC journalists, the ones you see on television. And like I said, about half of them replied, all of them replied, and about half of them agreed to be interviewed. And also, if those people don't become your interviewees, make sure you have a plan B and a plan C. So just make sure that you have to see it with my hand. Start at the top and then kind of work your way down. Don't work at the bottom and work your way up. That's not the way to do it. Be ambitious, be positive. Start at the top and then work your way down if people say no. Okay, slide number 15. I'm going to say very important. I know I say that about every slide, but this is the one when you realise how much work is involved in interviews. Now the point is, about interviews is that people, when they speak much quicker than you can write. And that's pretty obvious, I think, isn't it? But just be aware of the quantity of words spoken. Now, the golden rule here, folks, and I know there's lots of variety, excuse me, but generally speaking, people speak around about 100 words per minute. Some people speak really slowly, other people speak really quick. But generally speaking, every minute of speech generates 100 words. So a 20-minute interview, if your interviewee is speaking non-stop for 20 minutes, or it might be a 30-minute interview, in which case she speaks for 20 minutes, you speak for 10, that's 2,000 words. That's a lot of words, isn't it? I mean, that is the length of, essentially, of your assessment number 3. And I'll give you an example, in bottom left corner, with my PhD. This took me a year to do, this chapter. This one chapter took me a year to do. 26 interviewees, about 1 hour each, 10 questions per interviewee. So that worked out, if I were to type all of that up, that's about 6,000 words per person, which equates to 156,000 words. PhD maximum is 100,000. So those 26 interviewees could have, if I transcribed all their words, I could have written 1.5 PhDs. That's how much people speak. And the other thing is, of course, about people speaking, is a lot of it is repetition, hesitation, deviation. You know, people don't just speak in this kind of factual step-by-step way. They're all over the place. They hesitate, they repeat themselves, as I've just done. You know, so just be aware that interviews, like I said right at the beginning, they're actually quite difficult. They're quite difficult to do, because you've got to sort through all those words. And the more words that people speak, the more sorting you have to do. So next slide, number 17. I've said here all interview material is subjective. I'm going to qualify that slightly. Can I change the word all into most? Because there are examples, well, lots of examples actually. I don't know why I use that word all. Some interview material, it depends what people are talking about. So if you're talking about science, or if you're talking about the world, although saying that, so I mean, there are universal truths. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. So particularly in the physical world, although saying that, there are people that believe the world is flat. Okay, but 90% of people believe that it is a sphere. It's like a big ball in the sky, right? Or 95 or 99% or whatever it is. But there are some people who believe that it's flat. Well, look at the American election, for goodness sakes, at the moment. You know, there are quite a lot of people in the States who believe that Donald Trump was cheated and that he actually won. I think it's somewhere I read or heard the other day, 70% of Republicans think he was cheated. So if that's about 35% of the American population. So you could say it's a matter of opinion who won the American election. I would say, well, it's not really, because it's a matter of how many people voted for each candidate in each state. And then I don't want to go down that track of having a debate about the American election. But just think about subjectivity and objectivity. Some things, they are objectively true. But a lot of things, which is my point here, are actually subjective. So, for example, if you're interviewing people about what they think about, I don't know, a TV programme, The Crown, that's big at the moment, isn't it? The Crown, the one about the royal family. So if you interview somebody and they say it's a gross distortion of reality and it's very, very disloyal and unpatriotic, that's a subjective opinion. You might find somebody else who says it's very enlightening and it's a true reflection of what really happened. So both of those are subjective. And this is what I mean with this slide. Interview material is subjective. So somebody's interpretation of a program, what it means, you know, whether it was biased or not, whether it was one-sided, those are subjective comments. It's the audience member who decides whether it's any good or not. And likewise, if journalists are talking about their work, that's subjective as well. You might see that certain patterns repeat themselves and come back, and journalists, for example, they'll often say the same thing as each other because they're working in a similar environment with similar training and similar expectations. But the key point in the blue box, just because one person says something, it doesn't prove it. It doesn't prove it. Just because Donald Trump says that there were thousands of ballot papers dumped outside counting centres and set fire to, it doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean it's true. Because we would want, well, it's a horrible thought, but we would want some some evidence, photographic evidence or something. So don't, just remember this word subjectivity. Interview material is by its nature very subjective. Like I said, I want to change that word all into some interview. But I think hopefully you know what I mean. It's not like content analysis where it's manifestly true that there were 6 people who quoted in this article, and this article really was 342 words long. That's objective. It's indisputable. Interviews material is not. Make sure you fine-tune your questions. And I remember when I did my PhD, it took me ages. I started out with a rough idea of what I wanted to discover, but it took me several iterations to get to the point where the questions were perfectly phrased. And I spoke to my supervisor about getting feedback on my questions, what I want to discover, how to phrase them. Phrasing your question is really, really important, because you don't want it to be open-ended, you don't want it, or too open-ended, you don't want it to be ambiguous, you don't want it to be what's called a leading question, where you kind of lead the interviewee down a certain track. So there is a real skill to fine-tuning your questions. So if you are doing interviews, make sure that you speak to your supervisor. So again, pre-interview, most of this is pre-interview, so we're on point number 6. We haven't even met anybody yet. Point number 6, do your contacts, make your contacts through your email. And I've said in the blue box, use your university email address. And I don't know whether I've told you this group this story, but I always tell my students when we talk about interview. A few years ago, when I worked at Cardiff, I had a chat with one of the students. She came to me and she said, "Oh, Gary, I'm really frustrated." She says, "I want to do interviews for my dissertation and nobody's replying to me, and I've sent, I don't know, 10 emails and nobody's replied." And I said, "Well, can I have a look at your email?" So she showed me a copy of her email. I noticed that she was using her personal email account. And I said to her, "Do you think maybe that your email name suggests why you're not getting replies?" She said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "Well, I don't, maybe people aren't taking you seriously." And her email address, and to give you a little bit of context, so this woman was actually Welsh. Her email address was dizzyandwelsh@hotmail.com. Now, dizzy, for those of you who don't know, means a bit, "Oh, I don't know what's happening, I'm a little bit useless," So, even though she used that personal email account, it probably amused her mates and amused her. It's not going to amuse. She was trying to interview politicians. It doesn't amuse politicians. So I then suggested, try sending your emails. Just use your normal name, first name, last name, at hotmail.com, or use your university account. Now, university accounts, people are going to take them seriously because universities are serious institutions. So write a short, direct, polite email. And really all you need is 3 paragraphs. Introduction, in other words, who you are, what you're doing. Second paragraph is what you need and why. And the third paragraph is what you suggest next. So I suggest we have a discussion, half an hour, next Wednesday, blah, blah, blah. And if you do that, and it's quite a skill to write those types of emails, but once you've got it sorted, it's something which you can copy and paste and modify. But most importantly, keep it short, keep it very polite, and keep it direct. And you'll be surprised how many people will actually agree. On that, saying that, I often get emails myself from students at other universities who want to interview me, and I hate to say this, but I always say no because I'm just too busy. And quite often it's because their emails are rambling and incoherent. If they're short and to the point, they might have a chance. Okay. 21, slide 21. So the next one is where, when and how. In normal times, the best way to do it is number 1, face-to-face. But we're not in normal times, as we know. So phone or Zoom is a good way to do it. I've put third choice email in red. Avoid email interviews. Please avoid them. And the reason is, if you email a load of questions, number 1, the recipient, as I often do when I get them, thinks I don't have time for that, because replying actually takes quite a lot of time, doesn't it? You can get much more done in a phone interview or a Zoom interview or a face-to-face interview than in the same time period of writing an email. So try and avoid emails. The other reason why email interviews are bad is there's no interaction. So your recipient can sit there, think about the answer, maybe consult his or her boss, maybe get a little bit of corporate nonsense from their employer, copy and paste that from the website, and put it all in. And really, email interviews are not very useful at all. They're not interactive, and no, it sounds crazy, but people can put too much thought into their answers. So try and avoid email interviews. Point number 8. Right, here we go. Finally, point number 8. We're actually in the interview now. So you've done your emails, you've got in touch with your subject, your interview subjects, you've perfected your questions and all that sort of stuff. So here's the interview, it starts. So when you're doing your interview, make sure that you record it and you take notes. Now you can record it either on your phone or on a specialist, as I do, a specialist voice recorder, which are very, very useful. Obviously make sure you got loads of batteries. Obviously make sure the red light comes on, and because these are things that I've done wrong in the past, and there's nothing worse than interviewing somebody for half an hour and then realizing that it's not recording. So make sure that it's all happening. Before you do all that, of course, you need to ask the recipient if it's okay if you record it. Most people will say yes. If they hesitate, or if they say, well, I'm not sure about that, the way to sell it to them is say, well, look, I don't actually do shorthand, I'm not a very fast writer, and I want to make sure that I'm completely, quoting you in a very faithful way. So, and recording it will ensure that I don't misquote you. That's the way to kind of sell it to them. As I say, technology can go wrong, so make sure that you do make the occasional note just to point things out. And notes also help you focus. So what I do when I'm interviewing somebody, I get the recorder going, and if they make a particularly powerful point, or an amusing point, or a insightful point, then I actually write it down and put it in speech marks. And I kind of look at the time and make sure I know that where it is on the recorder as well. So really important that you do both. You've got to record and take notes. Don't just sit there and kind of kick back and like enjoy the chat. That's not the way to do it. Number 9. This seems a bit contradictory, but what you have to do is stick to the questions. Those questions that you sweated over and perfected, make sure you stick to them. But you can deviate if necessary, because people being people, they never cease to amaze you and surprise you. So the journalist might start talking about sourcing, why he uses certain sources, and then he might deviate and start talking about how much his boss always insists that he definitely always make sure that you put these people in your article and don't put those people in the article. So he's deviating slightly, but that is actually quite interesting. So to make sure that you understand that, you have to listen very carefully. Again, don't be passive in the interview. You need to be engaged and really connect with what the person's saying. So, as I said, kind of contradictory. Stick to your questions, but you can deviate if necessary. And the flip side of this, so this is even more confusing. So your interviewee might be droning on. He might be telling you about his latest golf match or something, or a bunch of flowers that he bought his wife, or what, and that's kind of not relevant. But be polite and let them just say what they need to say. But you hear interviewees on television doing it very politely. They kind of drag them back to the main point. So kind of let them deviate, but only deviate if it's relevant and enlightening. And at all times be polite, because what you don't want is for the interviewee to say, "Oh, I don't have time for this," and to storm out dramatically. Slide number 25. So like I said, the previous couple of slides, in the interview, all you have to do is listen and stay on track and record it and nod your head and be polite and be a nice person. That's it. So all of the stuff that you have to do really is before the interview and after. So slide number 25, post-interview. This is where the work really begins, and this is where it takes ages and ages and ages to actually get to the hub of what it's all about. So what I would do, and what I did when I've done research like this before, is as soon as I get home I listen to the recording again, and you take more notes. And if you listen to it again, you can actually highlight those areas that are really substantial. Because if you leave it a couple of days and then listen to it, it's not fresh in your memory. It's much better to do it early on. So listen to your recording again and make a note of the time through your recording of where the interviewee says something substantial. And then in future you can focus on that instead of going through the whole thing again. So do it as soon as you get back finish your interview. Listen to the whole thing and find the substance. Slide number 26. Then you need to organise the material and think about the structure of your analysis. And the clever thing to do is to organise your questions in the right order. So you're thinking about the structure of your essay or your dissertation before you even ask the questions. So if you organise your questions in the correct sequence, then that makes this stage of the process much easier. So you need to organise the material. And then the way that I did it, if you look at slide number 27, that's a real life example. So that's a photograph of basically my tick sheet, my check sheet. On the left hand side are the names, the family names of all the journalists I interviewed for my PhD. So Wilby, Brooks, Servini, etc. And across the top are the questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So a tick means that I've listened to that person's answer for question 1, question 2, question 3. And X means that I've listened to it and transcribed it. And so basically that's 26 multiplied by 5, what's that, 130. So that's 130 recordings for that part of the chapter that you had to go through. So what I did was I listened to each answer to the same question, then I listened again. There was stopping, starting, transcribing, taking out the best bits, and then I started writing. So this is what I meant right at the top of the class today, that interviews are a lot of work to do it, to do them successfully and thoroughly. Just be aware, when I use examples from my PhD, don't forget a PhD is I think it's about 6 times more than an MA dissertation. It's 6 times longer, 90,000, yeah, 90,000 versus 15,000. So when I talk about 26 interviewees, if you were doing it for your MA dissertation, you'd probably be expected to do 5 or 8 interviewees. So don't get freaked out by the magnitude of PhD work. And then slide number 28, verbatim quotes and paraphrase. And this is more of a journalistic technique, but no, again, it's relevant for academics. What's really boring when you're in my position reading a dissertation is when you get a huge chunk of direct quote, and that's what we call a verbatim quote. So it's every word for word that the person said. It's a faithful representation, so it's the written version of what came out of their mouth, exactly. A paraphrase is when you put it into typically a shorter phrase and fewer words. So you're paraphrasing what somebody said. You need to master the art of paraphrase. If you want to be a good writer, it doesn't matter whether you want to be a journalist, a novelist, an academic writer, you need to learn how to paraphrase, and it's actually quite difficult to do. And I remember from years ago when I was a kid, you know, the teacher used to say, the teacher would tell us something and she said, right, now put that into your own words. So tell it me back, but don't quote me directly. And essentially that's what she was doing all those years ago, was encouraging us to learn to paraphrase. It's actually quite difficult to do. So putting somebody else's words in your own words without losing the meaning and without being inaccurate. So make sure that you do a combination of verbatim quotes. I always save verbatim quotes for the really powerful stuff. You know, they're really powerful, or they're very amusing, or they're very insightful, and you can paraphrase the rest of it. But you need to quote accurately, so don't twist and turn their words. And you also need to blend quotations and paraphrasing with your general narrative. And then slide 29, I've given you an example. This is related to one of the 12 questions from my PhD, and this shows you how to paraphrase and how to quote. You can read that at your leisure. At slide number 30, at the end of all this, you will have loads of unused material, loads and loads and loads. You will have all of those words that you've never referred to, you've never quoted, you've never even paraphrased. Key point here, folks, slide 30, is don't worry, because it happens to everybody, and there will only be a small number of the words that you will actually use in your finished work. And the final point there in the blue box is do not write the transcript. And my heart sank. This literally a couple of years ago, and I said to a student, she was doing interviews, she was interested in news consumption. It's quite interesting. She was looking at 3 different generations, so the senior generation, the middle generation and the young generation, where they get their news from and why they go to Facebook or Twitter or wherever it is, right? Really interesting stuff. And I said to her, I think she interviewed 10-15 people, I said to her right at the beginning, don't do transcript. A transcript is when you sit down, you put your earphones in and you type up every word that every person said. And I said, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. I said it from right at the beginning, And about 3 months later, I saw her again. She said, Gary, I've got a confession. I said, what's that? She said, I've done the transcripts. And I said, why? She said, I don't know. I don't know why I did it. I don't know why I didn't listen to your advice, but I started doing it, and I promised all my interviewees that I would do it, and therefore I've done it. And it took her longer to do the transcript than it took her to do the rest of her dissertation, right? So don't do transcripts. I can't make it any clearer. Not even for a PhD do you need to do transcripts. What you can do these days is just put a little note in the appendix of your work that said that recordings are available if needed. So if your supervisor wants to check on something, he or she can say, can you give me the recording for this interviewee on this day? Keep your recordings, and then your supervisor or whoever can see them or listen to them in future. But don't do transcripts. It's a complete waste of time. Life is too short and unpredictable, folks, to do transcripts. Okay, so that is a whistle-stop tour of interviews. We'll have a break now, and then we'll move on to surveys and audience research. But any questions about this? I realise it's not directly relevant, but it might be useful in the future.